All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about wine faults, which is a very important topic. This is very helpful if you are serious about purchasing wine and spending some money on wine and understanding, what is acceptable and what's not, as far as some things that are kind of funky. Also, if you're, purchasing a nice bottle at a dinner at a restaurant, oftentimes they'll serve you a glass, and it's important that you can pick out these things in the event that that bottle is spoiled, and you can send it back with confidence. Also, if you're going to consider working in a tasting room, having the ability to pick out a wine that is flawed and making sure that you're serving correct wines to customers is very important. You are, the final quality control before that wine gets served to that customer. So it's very important that you understand what you're looking for. So some of these things are pretty rare exceptions. Some of these things are very common. If a bottle of wine is open for too long, some of these things can occur as well. So all very important things to know before you're serving wine to someone else or consuming it yourself. So wine faults. Let's get into it. So definition of a wine fault is an unpleasant characteristic of a wine. So it often comes from poor winemaking decisions, but it can also happen during the storage situation as well. So if a wine gets exposed to too much heat, too cold of temperatures, but also UV light exposure, all sorts of things that can also spoil the wine. But ultimately, it's any of these things that could come together, leading to unsavory flavors and aromas in the wine. So we definitely want to understand how to prevent that and how to identify it. A lot of times, some of these compounds are already in the wine, but at such low concentrations that we can't detect them. In some situations, some of the people might actually like these faults, and they can be said to add complexity to a wine, which is pretty interesting. Some of the best wines in competition have been analyzed and contain trace amounts of these things like VA, Brett, and other fault compounds. We're going to learn what these are. VA is volatile acidity, and Brett we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is vegetal characters. So vegetal characters is not necessarily a taint, but it can be something that is very unwanted in wines in extreme amounts, right? Some varieties have vegetal characters that are fantastic. Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc can be a green bell pepper taste to them, kind of vegetal, grassy notes, but that's totally fine. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about extreme amounts of vegetal and vegetation that makes a wine taste very green and very grippy and tastes like underripe grapes. So the compound that's responsible for these characters is trans-2-hexanal, and that has to do with the shape of this double bond here, and there's trans and there's cis, and then we have some other compounds here as well. But we're not an organic chemistry class, so you don't have to remember that. So extreme amounts of this vegetal character that is considered a flaw would be where they get these characteristics could be from extreme pressure during the pressing stage of harvest and processing. So this would extract all of the green character from the stems and the seeds. If the grapes themselves were severely underripe, it could give you that vegetal character. Stems, leaves, and green material left in the container while it's fermenting, you can extract those flavors too. So excessive stems and other, organic vegetal matter. So it can really take away from the fruit and the beauty of that wine and just give you the really interesting, kind of bizarre vegetal taste. So the next one that we're going to talk about is cork taint. We just did our presentation on wine hospitality. If you haven't seen that lecture yet, go back and check it. This is one of the big reasons that we don't allow chlorine as a cleaning agent in our tasting room and our winery. So the compound that causes cork taint is called TCA. It's 2,4,6-trichloroanisole. You don't have to memorize that. Just understand that it involves chlorine. And it's when chlorine comes into contact with microorganisms that are naturally present within the wine cork. Those organisms synthesize chlorine, and then they spit out the compound TCA. And this gives you a really musty smell. Some people say wet dog, wet cardboard. I've heard a couple of folks describe it as like a boardwalk, like underneath a boardwalk, kind of that salty, musty, wet kind of smell. But ultimately what we need to understand is that cork is not something that can be completely sterile. It's not a sterile product. Cork comes from trees, tree bark. It's very porous. Even though we make huge efforts to make it sterile and sanitized, there's going to be some level of microorganisms present. It's not anything that's going to make you sick. It's nothing that's going to harm you in any way, but it will affect the wine if it comes in contact with chlorine. And that could be cleaning chemicals, something that was used in the cellar. If the bag of corks was open and somehow the chlorine became volatile and reached onto that, if it was on your hands. Also, just for your wine cellar for storage, even though that the cork is in the bottle, if you didn't have a capsule or for any reason chlorine came into contact with your wine bottles, it's just not a good time. So I would not recommend doing that. So that's another one to look out for is cork taint. And cork taint, it probably happens every 1 in 1,000 bottles, or even less than that. But this could be one some people are really sensitive to, and this could be something that you find at a restaurant and you're like, hey, I think this bottle is cork tainted. Could the sommelier check this out, or a manager smell it for me and just be sure? So just something to know about. Next, we're going to dive into sulfur compounds, and we have 2 slides following this. One that is the positive sulfur compounds and one that are negative. So sulfur compounds in wine are also known as volatile sulfur compounds. So VSCs. Volatile just meaning that they emit a lot of smell. Volatile, so it's very smelly. So these compounds in a negative way can be caused by stressed yeast, a lack of oxygen in a wine's environment, and much more. But ultimately, what's the root of all these is the element sulfur, which is why they're sulfur compounds. So let's start off with the positive ones. So we have a group of chemicals called mercaptans, and this is where the sulfur compounds, live and are a part of. And there's some positive ones. So we have 3MH, which is 3-mercaptohexane 1-ol. You don't have to memorize these, don't worry. So just examples. We have 3MH, 3MHA, and then 4MMP. And 3MH and 3MHA, these first two, are very pleasant aromas. We have grapefruit and passion fruit. It's very, very nice. So you find these a lot in Sauvignon Blanc, some other white varieties. There's a lot of studies trying to find out how to bring out more of these aromas in white wines because they're so favorable and they're so pleasant. Then we get to 4MMP. This one is a really good example of how the concentration of a compound can change your experience when tasting wine. So in small concentrations, a lot of times these compounds are very pleasant and very enticing. So like small amounts of this compound smells like blackcurrant. Blackcurrant, also known as cassis, very popular compound. A lot of people search it out in some famous big cabs, especially from Europe. But in larger amounts of concentration with that exact same compound, it smells like cat pee in a wine. And that's very unfortunate. It's very unsavory. So similar things with things that smell like apple, and like the compound for that, very light concentrations, very pleasant. And then a high concentration can smell like rotting apples. So it's interesting what the threshold for those for each one is different. The concentration of when it goes from positive more into a negative thing, but something to look after. So then we have also within the class called mercaptans, which are sulfur compounds that are aromatic. We have the negative volatile sulfur compounds. So these are, same group, mercaptans, but these are the ones that are really undesirable in wine. And we call these reductive. So anytime a wine has a sulfur-based aroma that is not fantastic, it's called reductive or reduced. And some really common examples of this in wine are hydrogen sulfide. which smells like rotten eggs. We also have methanethiol, which is rotten cabbages, smelly socks, leeks, onions, cabbage, garlic, and then last but not least, propane and decaying fish. So these are all things that can absolutely be in wine, and they're very hard to get rid of in some situations. Some of these things cannot be they cannot be rid of the wine, and you just have to either try to blend it out or send the wine to a distillery to become brandy or something else. But these are ultimately caused by a stress in a fermentation. So kind of moving into what happens is, we have all these horrible smells: garlic, cooked cabbage, rotten eggs, we were talking about just in that previous slide. How does that happen in wine? Well, it ultimately comes from stress. So a fermentation under stress, yeast are consuming sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, right? Well, they also require oxygen to provide healthy cell walls and all these different things in their metabolism. And if they are not getting the nutrients or the oxygen that they need, the yeast will become cannibalistic. They will consume each other. They utilize each other's parts for nutrients and to help their metabolism go. And it creates what's ultimately stress on the fermentation. Well, what happens is their yeast are consuming themselves in an anabolic environment, so lacking oxygen, and they're eating up these amino acids that have sulfur end groups. So like we have the sulfhydryl end groups, and this is actually a very common situation in Syrah fermentations. And so they're eating all these amino acids that have sulfur end groups, cleaving the sulfur off and producing a compound called hydrogen sulfide, so H2S. And this has a very distinctive rotten egg smell, and it is like eggy fart. It's not a fun smell. It's very gross. It's very potent. It can be something that blows off, hydrogen sulfide. Not all of these things can. Like cabbage, garlic, leeks, onions. Those are not aromas that blow off of a wine. By adding more oxygen in, hydrogen sulfide can be blown off. But ultimately, it's very not pleasing. It's very hard. The best thing you can do is have a healthy fermentation and make sure your wine is getting enough oxygen during the winemaking process when it's appropriate. There's times in the winemaking process that we do want oxygen, and there's times in the winemaking process that we really try to avoid oxygen. Another way that wines can develop this reductive aroma is by sitting on unhealthy lees for too long. So it's kind of a similar situation where, let me take a step back. Lees is the yeast that's left over after fermentation. So after all the sugar has been converted to alcohol, all of those yeast cells sink to the bottom of the tank and they're inactive. So they're called lees, basically. The lees can help protect the wine from oxidation because it consumes oxygen. But over a amount of time, once it becomes stressed and it becomes unhealthy, it starts to smell bad. And then that smell leaches into the wine. So very important to keep track of that lees. And if it starts to smell bad, you just need to clean the tank, remove the lees from the wine, and then you should be in a better spot. But those are very, very common forms of reduction. Even for wines that are bottled without being filtered, it's very common to get that reduction because there's that leftover yeast in the bottle still, so you can get some of that character. Just put it in a decanter and let it open up and give it some time, and I promise it'll be a completely different wine. You give it 30 minutes, give it an hour, and it will be okay. Okay, so on the opposite side of reduction, so having a lack of oxygen present, now we have the other end of the extreme, which is oxidation. So oxidation in wine is not great. What it can look like is a wine that has a healthy red color starts to turn brown. So this is a very extreme kind of situation here. Thank you, Wine Folly, for this picture. So this is what it can look like oxidized. Sometimes before it turns this brown and before it's this obvious, if you tilt the rim of your glass, just the edge of the wine will have kind of a brown hue. So that can happen sometimes. If If the wine is a very old vintage, it might not be the worst thing. It's a sign of aging. But if it happens prematurely, it's really a sign of poor storage, poor wine making, and poor care of the wine. So we really try to avoid that. The fresh fruity flavors are going to diminish. The color will diminish. And just won't be a very fantastic wine to enjoy. So the characters that can arise from this are rotten apple, nutty, or sherry-like character. And the compound responsible for this is acetaldehyde. Cool. So oxygen creates oxidation in the wine, and then acetaldehyde comes in and adjusts the aromas to these rotten apple, nutty, or sherry-like characters. So in some situations, a wine that is brown or a wine that has sherry-like aromas is absolutely wanted. And those are for sherry wines, which is a very specific style of wine. This is a wine that's been aged in a barrel that is left with a space on top with oxygen on purpose. And it develops a very special type of yeast called flor yeast. That's this white film you see here. So that flor yeast is dependent on the oxygen to create the flavors required for that style of wine. So cool climate and high humidity are also needed, but just keep in mind that a brown colored wine or oxidized wine is sometimes the style that is desired. Another type of wine that we see this with is Madeira. A very good wine, oxidized, fortified, and will last forever on your counter. And very good for cooking as well. So just keep that in mind. Okay, next we have volatile acidity, or VA. This is very common in wines and can even be appreciated in small amounts, I guess, for lack of a better word. So in small amounts, there's a term in the industry called VA lift. So a little bit of vinegar will lift the fruity components of a wine and make it very desirable to drink. This isn't a compound that's going to make you sick. People consume vinegar and drink vinegar all the time to help with their gut. So this isn't going to be something that makes you sick in this situation. What causes VA is a bacteria called Acetobacter, and it's very common just when the wine is exposed to oxygen and bacteria. It just starts to form and spontaneously do its thing. So there are two types of VA that can be found in wine. And one is acetic acid, and that is just vinegar. It just smells like vinegar. And then we have ethyl acetate, which is a similar compound, but this is using alcohol to form this ethyl acetate portion, and that smells like nail polish remover. So either of those are definitely seen in extreme amounts as a flaw in a wine. In small amounts, it can be okay. Interestingly enough, like the sodas that are very popular right now, like Poppy, and I'm forgetting the name of the other one. Those are sodas that are advertised as being good for your gut, right? And low in calorie, but they're very fruity and they're actually pretty good. So I think that these are a perfect example of VA lift in a modern day beverage. They have a little bit of fruit flavor, a little bit of vinegar in there, but that vinegar really boosts that fruity flavor. So that way they've created a drink that's supposed to substitute for sodas, right? So if you haven't tried a Poppy or any of those sodas, check them out. I think for the sake of research, it's a very fun example of VA lift in that situation. So if you are a winemaker and you're trying to prevent VA from happening in your wines, the best thing you can do is do not allow any extra space in your barrels or tanks that's not protected. So any headspace is what we call it, headspace in a tank with oxygen in it is going to create this reaction. So in your tanks or your barrels, the best thing you can do is to fill that space with wine. So make sure your barrels are topped regularly, or to use a gas to evacuate the oxygen in that space and keep it from occurring. So you could use carbon dioxide, nitrogen, or argon. Argon is the most expensive gas that you could purchase, but it is one of the best, and that's because argon is so naturally heavy. It actually blankets on top of the wine to protect it. Nitrogen is a good standard for a second choice. It fills the area. Nitrogen is one of the most prevalent compounds in our atmosphere, so that's relatively easy to obtain. Carbon dioxide naturally kind of just disperses, so that's not the best thing, but it's better than nothing. So you'll have to go back and, regas the tanks or the barrels that you're using, depending on what type of gas that you're using. But that'll be very helpful in preventing VA from occurring in your wine. Also, making sure that your sulfur dioxide levels, your free SO2, are within the appropriate ranges. That'll keep VA from occurring as well. But that is very important to remember. That's a prevention, not a treatment. Once you have VA, you'll have to bring in a special filtration system to really get rid of it. Once you have it, you have it. It's very expensive to try to get rid of it. So definitely worth mentioning. All right, next we have Brettanomyces, also known as Brett, which is always feel bad when I meet a winemaker whose name is Brett, because I feel like it's almost bad juju in the industry, but they can't help it. So Brettanomyces species, or just known as Brett, is a wild yeast that's commonly used in brewing, but really should be avoided in wineries. It's great in beers, makes fantastic beers, but in wine, it makes a wine smell like bandage, horse sweat, or barnyard, which is really not what the style that we're going for in a wine. The horrible thing about Brett is that it actually outcompetes the type of yeast that we use in the winery. So once it becomes prevalent and once it manifests itself at a winery, it kind of takes over like a very serious disease. It kind of just takes over the whole winery, and no matter what yeast you use, it'll start to outcompete and consume the wine before your Saccharomyces, the type of yeast that we prefer, does. So once the winery is infected with this yeast, it's very difficult to get rid of it. And this is one of the big reasons that you'll never find a winery and a brewery in the same building. A business may sell both of those items in the same building, but they should not be actively making both of those beverages in the same building because of that cross-contamination. They should be in different rooms. You should be wearing different boots, using separate equipment. It's a very serious cross-contamination, and you have to be really careful about that. So definitely keep that away. Okay. Next on our list is heat damaged, also known as cooked wine. So a wine that's been exposed to heat for a long period of time will rapidly age, and it will create dull and flat flavors. So in very serious situations, the wine will become stewed, display prune or raisin-like flavors. Warning signs of this is your cork in your bottle has been slightly pushed out, or there are signs of seepage around the cork. So what you'll see on the cork normally is you'll see an even line of where the wine has soaked through. If the wine has come up one side kind of oddly but not on the other, that means that either the cork is not the right size for that, or at one point the pressure in the bottle changed and it forced that wine up on the cork like that, and that could be from heat. So heat expands liquids and gases, expands everything. So that could have been a pressure change due to heat damage. So definitely look after that. That's not a fun time. Fun fact about this one, someone at some point had turned up the temperature on my parents' wine fridges. I didn't know that was an option. I thought they only cooled, but you can actually turn up the temperature. And my parents' wine got cooked, and yes, the cork started to push. The only wines that were still drinkable from that fridge were the port styles. So the really sweet fortified wines were the only ones that were drinkable. Everything else was ruined. So yeah, now you know. Just be careful you have your wine fridge at the right settings. Okay, moving on. So we talked about heat damage from cooking wine, and now we're going to talk about the opposite. So tartrate crystals are formed can be formed during aging, but also when a wine is exposed to very, very cold situations. So say you're throwing a party, you're having a friend over, you forgot to chill your bottle of wine, you throw it in the freezer, and you forget about it. When you pull it out of the freezer, you find these little crystals at the bottom, and your first thought is, oh my gosh, are those glass shards? The answer is no, they're not glass shards. They're just tartrate crystals, also known as potassium bitartrate. It's a harmless byproduct of winemaking. This is really just a cosmetic fault. When this happens in a wine, it's really just called an instability of cold. So cold instability. It's nothing wrong with the wine. It's not going to make you sick. It's totally safe to consume and drink. It is a cosmetic fault. And a lot of uneducated consumers will think it's broken glass or that the wine has gone bad and they won't want to drink it anymore. So that's all there is to say about that. Sometimes sommeliers will call it wine diamonds, which I think is funny. But there's nothing wrong with them. It does happen, though. Moving into ropiness, hopefully you'll never have to experience this in your life. I have not, and I hope I never do, but it sounds horrible. So ropiness is caused by a bacterial taint that creates an oily or slimy appearance in the wine, and it can even form like tiny, like mucus rope-shaped formations in the wine. Its consistency has been compared to raw egg whites. In French, the term for these wines is, I think this is pronounced grace. I'm sorry, I don't speak French, which translates to fat. So a very fatty, oily consistency. And it's produced by this lactic acid bacteria. It's a rare form of spoilage, but if you keep your cellar hygienic and use regular sulfur dioxide, this should prevent this from occurring. And I did read that you could consume this wine if you wanted to. It should not make you sick. There's no correlation of that yet. But you'd probably have a really hard time getting past the texture of that. And I probably just wouldn't recommend it in general. It doesn't sound like a good time. Interestingly enough, this wine does not necessarily have to have like high amounts of VA or vinegar smell. It's more of a texture situation, which is pretty gross. Next, we have mousiness. This is also very rare. I have not experienced a wine with this in it yet. And this one is really strange because this is not a fault that you can immediately smell from a glass. You actually have to put the wine in your mouth. And once the wine interacts with the lower pH of your mouth, that compound becomes volatile and you can smell it. So it's not until you actually put the product in your mouth that you experience this fault. It's very poorly defined, but it is known to have a mucky aftertaste and an aroma of caged mice. So if you ever had a mouse infestation in your garage or a rat situation, that smell is very prevalent and very intense. And the research says that it's most likely caused by Brett and Decara type yeast. So Brett, we talked about the horse sweat and kind of barnyard smell, so kind of in that family. And also certain strains of lactic acid bacteria can do this as well. So really not great. But yeah, try to keep those spoilage yeast and bacteria out of your wine, out of your cellar, and you should be okay. But yeah, not a great one. Next on our list, and a little less yucky, is UV damage. So this is also known as light strike in wine. And this is the reason that most of our wine bottles are that beautiful dark green color, that agate green, and that's to help prevent light damage. And that's also a really good indication of some wines, especially white wines that are meant to be aged, I feel like are in those darker green bottles. If it's in a clear glass, it's most likely made to be consumed right away. But there's always exceptions to that. And glass has been really hard to obtain recently. So again, there could be some exceptions to that. So what happens is when wine's exposed to UV light, like outside, but also indoors as well with like fluorescent light bulbs, when it's left under these lighting conditions for too long, the UV light will actually damage the wine. And what happens is you have vitamin B2, which is riboflavin, becomes activated by this UV, it becomes energized, and then it transfers that energy into amino acids such as methionine and cysteine. And these are amino acids that have sulfur end groups, and these become cleaved and create hydrogen sulfide in some of those mercaptans that we were talking about earlier. So the garlic, that cooked cabbage smell, that stinky egg smell, that could be coming from light strike. So something to be aware of and something to try to keep out of. And the wines that are most affected by this are white wines and sparkling wines, and wines with clear glass in general. So the dark glass should be pretty protected. But if you are a serious wine, a buyer, and you want to store wine and you want to have a wine cellar, definitely stay away from those fluorescent lights. Keep to LEDs. You want a dark space. You want to store wine on its side so the cork remains hydrated. All sorts of things go into it, humidity, etc. But definitely something to think about, right? All right. And that brings us to our sources. So if you're interested in any of the content I presented on, these are not my original ideas. Of course, I did not write the book on wine faults. But if you'd like to read more about it, I do have captioned or linked here Wine Folly's website, Oxford Academic. I also used our textbook that's referenced for a lot of this class material, which is Making Sense of Wine Tasting by Alan Young. And then also this Art Ratio website was fantastic as well. And last but not least, we have our student learning objectives for your guys' studying purposes. And that is it for wine faults. So, I hope you learned something new, and I hope you enjoyed learning that. And if you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time.